So we might start recording. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alison Keith, and I'm the director of the Jackman Humanities Institute and a professor of classics and women's studies here at the U of T. I am so very pleased to welcome you all to a public lecture by Michael Nylan, Sather Professor of History at UC Berkeley, who joins us today as the JHI Distinguished Visiting Fellow for 2021-2022. The Jackman Humanities Institute is now in its 14th year of operation. It's the happy result of two very generous donations of $15 million each by former University of Toronto Chancellor, the Honorable Henry N.R. Jackman. His donations were double matched by the university, creating a $90 million endowment to support research in the humanities and humanistic social science disciplines at the University of Toronto. The JHI's mandate is to create new networks, both virtual and physical, for interaction in creative research and study that complement and go beyond the mandates of individual disciplines. The JHI is at heart an interdisciplinary project, and over the past 4.5 years, I've been thrilled to be exposed to research in an extraordinarily wide range of fields. Professor Nylan is working this week and next with our circle of fellows at the JHI, who are drawn from a very wide array of disciplines, as well as from all three campuses and from across the humanities and humanistic social sciences. And they're conducting research at every level, including undergraduate students, doctoral candidates, postdoctoral researchers, and senior faculty members. The JHI also advocates for the humanities internationally, and it's in this context that we bring a distinguished visiting fellow to the U of T each year. Professor Nylan's work is a brilliant match for our theme of pleasure this year, and she joins an impressive roster of previous visitors that includes Marjorie Garber, Mika Bal, Arjun Appadurai, Audra Simpson, Amitav Ghosh, and last year, Dion Brand, who initiated the online format in which we still find ourselves meeting today in the midst of global pandemic and climate conflagration. And it's in this context that I want to acknowledge Toronto's complex history on the shared lands and waters of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee nations and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Wendat, Huron also have long and deep relationships with this land and water. Toronto is home to many other Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, South America, and the globe. There are important long-lasting connections between Black and Indigenous communities in the city, and the Jackman Humanities Institute is committed to acknowledging these communities and building partnerships with them. In addition to other foundation treaties, some between Indigenous nations and others with the Canadian Crown and nation state, these lands and waters are part of the Dish with One Spoon agreement. This agreement is concerned with taking only what we need, leaving enough for the next one, and cleaning up after ourselves. In this spirit, I want to express my gratitude for having the opportunity to work in the community and in this territory. In a minute, I'm going to turn over the virtual floor to Professor Shafiq Virani, who will introduce the work of this year's JHI Distinguished Visiting Fellow. But first, let me just note a couple of housekeeping details before we get going. The talk is being recorded, but people are very welcome to turn their cameras on if they're comfortable doing so. Please keep your mics muted while our guest is speaking. You'll be able to unmute if you want to ask a question at the end. I also want to take this opportunity to introduce Professor Mohan Mathan, Professor of Philosophy at UTM, who will thank Professor Nylan after her talk and moderate the Q&A session. And now I'm very pleased to turn over the virtual floor to Professor Shafiq Virani of the UTM Department of Historical Studies, with cross appointments to the Department for the Study of Religion and the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations, who will introduce the work of this year's JHI Distinguished Visiting Fellow, Professor Michael Nylan. Shafiq.
Thanks very much, Professor Keith. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Nylan to all of you. My first encounter with her was through a seminar conducted by my colleague, Dr. Linda Feng, just a few weeks ago. Professor Feng drew us into the fascinating world of pleasure depicted in Professor Nylan's writings. It was the perfect gateway for a topic that all of us at the Jackman Humanities Institute will explore for the rest of the year. And who could be a better companion and guide on this journey than Dr. Nylan? Sather Professor of History at UC Berkeley, where she also received her BA, Michael Nylan did an MA at the State University of New York at Buffalo before completing her PhD at Princeton. A self-described small-town girl from a Kentucky farm, she is truly a virtuoso, drawing on the findings of multiple disciplines in her writings on early Chinese history, from gender studies to manuscript culture, from archaeology to philosophy. In today's presentation, entitled On Pleasure, Looking Back, she will help us explore the labyrinthine wonders of antique Chinese pleasure theories, the secure trust people build within their family and circle of friends, and trust in the beneficence of the cosmos were the pillars on which Chinese luminaries built their theories. She wonders if the globalized world of today can ever return to that era and asks, what can we then do going forward? In the 5 minutes we were just chatting right before going live right now, just bouncing ideas around about decolonizing the mind, I couldn't get enough of her wisdom. So I know that all of us are just going to love her talk. E.B. White, the famous American author who gave us such classics as Charlotte's Web and The Trumpet and the Swan, once commented for the New York Times, quote, "If the world were merely seductive, that would be easy. If it were merely challenging, that would be no problem. But I arise in the morning, torn between a desire to improve the world and a desire to enjoy the world. This makes it hard to plan the day," unquote. Given the virtuosity I've already witnessed from Professor Nylan, I know that her talk on pleasure will leave us both with the desire to improve the world and the desire to enjoy it. I know that we're going to enjoy this talk. Thank you very much, Professor Nylan, and welcome to the University of Toronto.
Thank you. What a great quote. Yes, I'm torn myself. I want to say that it is a great pleasure to be given time to reflect upon what drove me to write a book called The Chinese Pleasure Book. And I worked on it for 20 years. Usually academics are rushing on to the next project, whether it's teaching, researching, or writing. The chance for reflection is precious then, and all the more so, given that we have been badly thrown off by recent events, what I would call geopolitics plus the pandemic. At recent demonstrations, I keep seeing the sign, if you're not worried, scared, nervous, you're not paying attention. Yes, but then what? It took me 18 years to write the pleasure book in spurts, then more than a year working on proofs for a distinguished press that had never published on a Chinese subject, they told me. And then because the press migrated to a new home, it seemed as if there were 2 lost years when the press was reorganizing, and then whammy, the pandemic shut things down. So this, for me, is a really rare opportunity, and I thank the Humanities Center, its wonderful staff, everyone I've interacted with, from graduate students to faculty, everyone gathered here. It's been a total pleasure. With the benefit of hindsight, such experiences have helped me rethink what I hope the book would achieve for myself as well as for readers. And so while the lessons I learned through writing the book have stuck with me, I would definitely now also write a different book if I were starting over, for at least 3 good reasons. I've had the chance to oversee the translation of the book into modern Chinese and see what simply cannot be translated into the modern language. I've been huddled in a very small pandemic pod for nearly 2 years, deprived of some of the very keenest pleasures my book identified, especially traveling home. And I've had reviews, all positive, but as far as I was concerned, none of them understanding the issues at hand. These were from very smart people. They understood a lot, but I'll get back to that. So my talk today consists of 3 parts: what I discovered about pleasure while writing the book, what I wished I had stressed more about the role of pleasure in one's life, and where my own work is going now, thanks to the discovery I made about myself and the world I inhabit, with both pretty much in free fall. Let me begin with the simple part, the insights gained. Some people write to get ahead in their careers. I write to figure out what I'm thinking, always in conversations with the living and the dead. What shocked me to my core was how many well-educated people over the past 2 decades told me I was researching an unserious problem, pleasure being too much of the body, and in connection with China, a topic carrying too strong a whiff of the erotic. My Chinese texts, however, are predicated, not quite, that's okay, are predicated on the notion that the body and spirit work in concert. And that seemed to me a fact largely unregistered outside of experts in Chinese medicine. Thinking about the political appeals of pleasure was the genesis of the project. Luckily for me, is that turned out to be the easy part of the project. For my first essay on pleasure, I explored the thoughts of Xunzi, the pre-Qin philosopher, which are perhaps the most elegantly written and certainly the most systematic in all of classical Chinese. What Xunzi emphasizes is not the argument for which he is now best known, that human nature is an ugly sight to see, and here we should think of toddlers' tantrums. His own writings stress rather that no matter where people start, all human beings can acculturate themselves to civilized standards of social exchange that improve the quality of their daily lives, no matter what, if only because they can then learn to live with themselves. That thought, evincing a belief in a kind of human parity, and this was argued in a society of rampant human inequality, I found very pleasing. That process of writing about Xunzi went so well that I foolishly concluded that it would be easy to generate a whole book devoted to the topic of pleasure, with a single thinker and a single pleasure allotted to each chapter. Was I ever wrong? The first problem surfaced soon enough. There is hardly a writer in classical Chinese that does not speak in poems or in prose about the pleasures of friendship and music and books. Before the radio, TV, airplanes, the internet, visits from friends from afar were few and far between. And so one needed to learn to amuse oneself as best one could within a small group of family and neighbors, largely without novel distractions. The educated played music, and judging from our sources, they took human interactions more seriously than we do in our era of Facebook and impersonal trust. And through such interactions, the person could learn what repetitive actions deepened into profound pleasures and what delights began to pale or even annoy after a trial period. Ergo, my thinker's central claim that short-term delights are all well and good, but they cannot sustain, while investments in long-term relational pleasures are more likely to provide real aid and comfort. One of the key surprises for me when I started the pleasure topic was to discover that, with a few exceptions, the thinkers distinguish short-term delights, Sonia, next up, if possible, from long-term relational pleasures, defined as constructive and invariably humanizing. I'm going to illustrate the point without the slide. To illustrate their point, I can get a cheap thrill from hearing that a mean colleague has gotten her comeuppance, but that is unlikely to make me wiser or more decent. And my desire for panna cotta may wane after 2 enormous helpings. Another formidable obstacle to writing the book was this. To understand my Chinese authors, I needed to immerse myself in their milieu, long centuries before my own, and a time and place where people presumed resonance theory, not the chief modern binaries of mind, body, male, female, nature, culture, and individual versus society and state. Resonance theory, simply put, demands that we understand ourselves always to be operating in what the physics people call the butterfly mode. We need to be supremely aware that we are not self-contained, individual, autonomous, rational beings, but rather porous containers affected by the smallest flutters in our universe, whether we notice their cumulative impact or not. And the only way for me to understand resonance theory was to take neuroscientific, sociological, and psychological studies far more seriously in order to understand how we human beings carve our neural pathways and see and imagine new things. Also, to become more aware of our surroundings. And I have to say, this is something that my academic training had worked to grind down in me, this awareness of my surroundings. All this meant more time in reflection, even if it was worth it. With some of the re-envisioning process underway, I began to think about the links between music and friendship. Thanks to friends of mine, I realized that intimate friendships, like music, are both pre-verbal and post-verbal in this precise sense. Somehow, the love of a person or a piece of music is formed spontaneously for reasons we cannot begin to explain, and then sustained due to associations we do not entirely fathom. Why is it when I'm blue that I listen to Ella Fitzgerald or Stacey Kent or Bach or Bill Evans? Why is it that some soulmates continue down through the years with me, even when I rarely see them, while other connections, seemingly so vital at the time, quickly slip away? Why do meals shared in a congenial social space encourage me to try out self and social fashioning? And why does my ability to answer such big questions in no way subtract from my undeniable relish in living? After that, new questions came tumbling in. How do we come to really accept our human limitations of time, space, imagination, knowledge, while learning to be kinder to ourselves and others, essentially to start to laugh and to forget? And why do I so frequently return to books I have loved, including children's books, to remind me of what truly matters? Why do I need the aged and the dead, as well as the young, to expand my sense of what the good life is? One may as well ask, why am I a historian through and through? The questions I asked while writing the Chinese pleasure book were doubtless some of the right questions, even if my answers looking back seem overly belabored, as I learned as soon as I helped a good friend translate the book into modern Chinese. The translation process left me angry and miserable by turns. I had to keep trimming away my own dense subclauses, since my translator plainly hadn't a clue about what my prose was intending to suggest. And then there were the reviews. They were all good, but to me, all entirely missing the point of the book. For the reviewers, one and all, seemed to believe that I was seeking a path towards the attainment of a lofty state of permanent detachment, when E.M. Foster's fragile injunction to only connect would be nearer the truth. Still, gaining a sense of the book's limitations has not been a bad thing for me. For I see now in retrospect that the book lacks a strong enough sense of what my Chinese authors insisted upon, that we live in a society from the cradle to the grave, even if many of us fancy ourselves partial recluses. That we cannot rid ourselves of the impact of society and state for good or for ill, then becomes the strongest possible justification for socio-political re-engagement, with the aim of improving the institutions we have now and others will inherit. So out of my failures with the Chinese pleasure book, plus the difficulties of translating two classics of Chinese thought, The Art of War, ascribed to Sun Tzu, and the Chinese Documents classic, out of this has sprung my current engagement with ideas of the common good and the shared life. In other words, what we can and cannot expect from our public institutions given our mutually entangled lives. After all, being individual, autonomous, rational human beings has led us to an arrogant disregard for our planet Earth, our countrymen, our neighbors, and often even our families and closest friends. In other words, any rootedness in the collective. Given the myriad problems we confront, we no longer have any other options, in my view, but to rededicate ourselves to seeking improvements via our public institutions. Quite literally, we're running out of time with regard to climate change, conspiracy theories, and gross social inequities. The US has one of the worst track records in the world. Canada is better, but not good enough. Basic to the Chinese way of thinkers, and this is not the narrative we've been told, is a sense that all civilized people rely on strong institutions and rituals to impart a sense that they are grounded. They are part of a world that began before they were born and will continue after their deaths. I worry about the end of the Anthropocene, but for the moment, I don't go there. To engage with that world productively requires not so much the courage of our convictions, though with Yeats, I fear that the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. What we need is actually far more difficult, to realize that the other people we encounter and may or may not like confront a similar plight. To be human is to be plagued with fears and to feel uncertainty about nearly everything, including what we think, what our peers think, and what it means to die. Here is how one of my favorite Chinese thinkers puts it. Yes, Sonia, if you're there, we're 2 slides forward.
I apologize. I don't know why the slide wasn't changing, but I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to try again.
Yeah, not to worry. It's not crucial. Okay, nothing is crucial. Once a man receives, this is my Chinese thinker talking. Once Zhuangzi, for those of you who know Chinese philosophy. Once a man receives his complete bodily form, he keeps it, waiting for the end. Sometimes clashing with things and sometimes bending low before him, before them, he completes his course. Is he not pathetic? To the end of his days, he sweats and toils, never seeing his own accomplishments. Can you help? Here I am, great. Can you help pitying him? I'm not dead yet, he cries. But what's the good of that? The body decays and the heart and mind follow. Man's life has always been a muddle like this. There is no panacea offered here, no bright-sided optimism. I'm grateful for that. There is only hard work and a belief that together over time, our cumulative efforts might make a difference. This is, I believe, why the early empires in China were so highly ritualized. Unlike us North Americans, I guess I should say we North Americans, the early Chinese thinkers took the long view. They knew that a small slight, the smallest of slights, inflicted casually today can come back to haunt us, while the smallest kindness, a mere nod to the other person's fundamental worth, can reap untold rewards. Teaching requires this very act of faith, of course, and the story of Confucius, who went to his death believing himself to be a total failure, alerts us to the fact that we can never know our impact, for good or for ill. Like death itself, that will be taken care of. We don't need to worry about that. I grew up in a political family very involved in the civil rights movement in the South, in Kentucky. I was taught that one could only make a significant impact by finding a way to come together to establish common ground, despite obvious differences, mutual mistrust, unique experiences. As a feminist, I've worked to see what we can change if we pull together. Nonetheless, many aspects of modern life have assaulted those beliefs, ground them down, maybe that's the right way to say it, including my own first cousin's skullduggery in an Ohio election. Also, I teach at a big public university, and the bureaucracy there is truly mind-numbing. I give you a taste of business as usual. I recently received a small award of $25,000 from a Taiwanese foundation to supplement my salary while on leave this fall. Eventually, to get that sum, minus 40% deducted by the university for unspecified expenses, not quite, it's fine. I had to mobilize 2 deans, an associate dean, my department chair, a center director, plus an outside consultant to overturn one bureaucrat's distrust in foreign foundations. There went 3 weeks of my 1 semester leave while I was in Paris, no less. Yet finally, the arbitrary decision was overturned, and my institution has supplied me with untold riches in the form of excellent libraries, deep friendships, and a real place in humanities conversations. So I conclude that too many of us, myself included, have given up trying to locate a small patch of common ground with those we need to cooperate with in order to get anything useful done. I have spent much of the pandemic rereading old classics. Feeling this low, perhaps I couldn't risk using my limited time and energy on reading something new. Among the classics that I reread was Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. As not all men have read this book, I summarize her main thesis: that women need a bit of money and a measure of privacy in order to write and think. But I'm interested in her 3 underlying theses, which I think are even more important. First, that the body is good and the senses therapeutic. Second, that the goal of human beings, whether male or female, is to feel, in quotes, no need to be anyone but oneself, i.e. one's best self. And third, no human talents can flower in an atmosphere of subtle put-downs, let alone outright bullying. Like the poor, women tended to be, in Woolf's view, quotes, in quotes, snubbed, slapped, lectured, and exhorted. Woolf requires us to consider how unpleasant it is to be locked out in any way. That explains why Woolf ends up by denouncing all this pitting of sex against sex, and it's still going on. As she insists, life for both sexes is arduous, difficult, a perpetual struggle. And then Woolf follows these remarks with what seems to me to be a stupendous insight. Possibly when X-Man insists a little too much on the inferiority of women, he is concerned not with their inferiority, but with his own superiority. Put another way, men too often feel stripped of their dignity, and they fight back in the only ways they have learned. Afterwards, I stumbled upon a curious quotation from Virginia Woolf, written long before her suicide. The future is dark, and that is the best thing for it to be, I think. And I found this broadside against smug despair especially bracing when read in light of many passages in The Art of War, the Zhuangzi, even the Xunzi, stressing that no human being, no matter how qualified, will ever be able to size up fraught situations adequately, let alone control them. We may not like this lack of control one bit, but that is the human condition. For that reason, I found myself rereading another book, Joseph, I'm sure I don't know how to pronounce this, Sapsky's Lost Time, Lectures on Proust in a Soviet Prison Camp. Long story about why I got this book. The title would lead you to think that this book will be unbearably sad. But the book tells about a series of lectures given by political prisoners in Siberia to each other. And the lectures is the way they sustain themselves in their miserable conditions. Each lecture began by recalling something thoroughly lovable about life. And a surprising number of them discussed the books they thought had changed their lives. For moviegoers, this is the equivalent of Truffaut's Fahrenheit 451, where the books are destroyed, but the people have memorized them in preparation. Here is what one of the lecturers said about Proust. Proust's lengthy sentences with their endless asides, myriad remote and unexpected associations, their strange manner of treating entangled themes without any kind of hierarchy. The value of this style, with its extreme precision and riches, at once seems beyond me and very near. The highest form of entanglement, using elements convention considered incompatible, proved to be fertile ground for reflection, allowing commonplaces and singularities to exist side by side. But the highest forms of commitment to human interactions allow these singularities to flourish. When you come to visit me in Berkeley, this is on my door. It is Babars Dream. Curiously, not available in English, only in French. And of course, what it shows is that we all fear everything, and there is all kinds of ignorance, stupidity, ill will, etc., to be driven out of the world we inhabit. How people tend to navigate their worlds led me back to the central preoccupations of the Chinese texts I have as constant companions. What they teach in a nutshell is this, that unlike Aristotle's vision of the good life, there's no possibility of flourishing in Aristotle's free exercise of unimpeded virtue. When I'm irreverent, I think the Chinese were not that crazy. They knew that to flourish, one needed above all to confront impediments great and small, because that's what we have. My German isn't good enough to figure out what Wittgenstein really meant. I have a friend who's failing now and needs help, but I'm late for my lecture. I'm in Toronto, and so I'm not in Kentucky, and I can't get there from here. We presume stability and consensus as the norm, but that is the biggest mistake we can make. Justice is conflict, and that's because different parties, even honorable parties, are bound to see things differently, no matter what. That doesn't make me bad or them better. Planet Earth is fluid, dynamic, and much of it is beyond our ken, though we can and must do more to ensure its basic survival. When it comes to living a vital life that leaves no traces, and what that means is doesn't hamper others from leading vital lives, the Chinese thinkers begin with lesson number 1, know what is enough. The Confucius of the Analects says this, as does the Lao Tzu of the Tao Te Ching. I myself live in a very comfortable existence in an apartment filled with beautiful objects. I am certainly no ascetic. At the same time, I realized that my one small clothes closet holds exactly 4 pairs of shoes, and 2 of them are 20 years old. This is the benefit, I think, of having lived a rich life. I asked myself, do I really need that? As one of my smart undergraduates remarked, American life does not generally encourage us to distinguish flitting desires from pressing needs. So I am now consciously acquiring less in the hopes of feeling and doing more, even if I am a compulsive book buyer. On this single point, know what is enough, I'm happy to report that Aristotle in the Politics, book 7, concurs. Aristotle thinks that a modicum of wealth suffices, and we will have paid too dearly for our lifestyles if they come at the expense of leisure and deliberation. I'm hoping that if we spend time on leisure and deliberation, we can lengthen our attention spans, which are now on average 1 second less than that of a goldfish, according to the National Institute of Health in America. Today's neuroscientists, philosophers, and humanists all agree that a rich social environment absolutely requires the ability to imagine others as having intentional states comparable to our own, but also the allied ability to imagine ourselves as having intentional states different from our current ones. I have an allied insight. Human beings require long experience in community, not just some fictive autonomy, as well as courage and curiosity. As one philosopher, Scanlon, put it in a book called What Do We Owe One Another, each other maybe, to recognize human life is valuable, first and foremost, is to see the reasons we have for treating others in ways that accord with principles they could not reasonably reject. Confucius supposedly put it this way: behave when away from home as if in the presence of an important guest. We all have a fairly good sense, I think, of what constitutes the sort of treatment we would accord dignitaries, i.e., those deemed to have dignity. Dignity is hard to make into an abstract quality, and therein lies its attraction for me as a grounding for life. It requires us not only to meet, but also to anticipate the needs of others, as we would most certainly do if important guests came to visit. It requires continually asking others what they would need and like, rather than presuming what they deserve and merit. It requires us to regard those who are actually in our power as if they were higher powers, without conceding to worldly powers that power to harm ourselves or others. I would argue that the path of ethical development promises a much more interesting life as well. Actually trying to figure out what other people may be thinking, although I confess is sometimes painful, is just as good as reading a detective novel or seeing a movie, and often appreciably better. And it may lead us to push the central question. If we really value our own worth and dignity, how then would we begin to address the current disinclination to recognize the most basic facts about human existence in the world we know? The answer is obvious: by pushing forward agendas capable of correcting at least one or two of the very worst indignities that we see being inflicted on people. Meanwhile, any refusal to consider our world and its inhabitants with due care is a failure of the imagination about the long-term versus short-term, intended versus unintended consequence. All the classics and masterworks in Chinese emphasize a simple lesson: that things in due time do unfold, whether we will it to be so or not. No rational cost-benefit analysis will produce a precise tally of the dividends that may accrue from certain actions. Yet, as nearly all the classical thinkers, including Confucius, say, we must make the secular the sacred, and we must not only adopt this way of operating in the world, but also make it a habit before we can even begin to discern the possible benefits to be gained from this way of operating. Acknowledged or not, other people are our environment. In fact, they are the very air we breathe. They can help us learn to feel at home in our own skins and in the circles we operate. For greater human flourishing is to be found in connecting, communicating, and sharing, rather than working to gain or assert power over others. As I write this, I've been thinking a lot about what my colleague said to his undergraduate class, that this elevated concept, the way, is simply putting one foot forward, failing, assessing what went wrong, sometimes misassessing what went wrong, and then trying again. Whenever I try to think about this process, I think about the Dalai Lama. A Buddhist friend once dragged me to hear him speak at a New Jersey monastery, and I had to sit cross-legged for over 2 hours as the Dalai Lama described elaborate visualization techniques to advance devotees. I was not a happy camper. I can't even meditate well, let alone visualize a host of gods in multiple colors with discrete attributes. I was verging on angry and definitely bored. But when he finally stopped his lecture, the Dalai Lama smiled and said, and then after this meditation, you go out and sin again. This I have never forgotten. To say it plain, the Chinese thinkers are preoccupied with how to combine two senses of what in Chinese is called 智生. It's a 2-character phrase that means you need to earn a livelihood, but you also need to put your life in some kind of order. They know down to their very bones that there are many lives worth living, and there is no one form of lasting success in any life. To be feeling our way through the interstices is what the Zhuangzi calls mastering the art of living. In addition, they know 2 more things, and I'm nearly done, that once you break something, you cannot put it back together again. And here is where I would like to talk about the poet Merwin's Unchopping a Tree. That was a revelation. I bought it for a child of my acquaintance, and actually I refused to let it go. After I'd read it with the child, I had to order another copy. Here's what Merwin's own summary said. There's no mystery to chopping down a tree, but how do you put back together a tree that has been felled? Mystical instructions are required. The axeman may be meticulous. He attaches each leaf back. He packs down the sawdust to make a semblance. But, as Merwin writes, well into the book, we have no duplicate of the original substance. Ours, by which he means the rebuilt tree, is extremely strong, but it is also rigid. There is no play in it. And the new core is not the part that conducts life from the roots up to the branches and back down again. It is inert. Despite the intricate joinery, you cannot believe it will hold. But what more can you do now, having chopped the tree? What more can you do? Why mention a modern poet when my book is about Chinese antique pleasures? It's because lots of smart people in every time and place have known things, regardless of gender, national origin, and political affiliations. I wanted to call the Chinese pleasure book Ordinary Pleasures. My press refused. I wanted to push the point that learning how to make a better future possible is hardly rocket science. We just need to remember some basic lessons. I would add this now. Personal pleasure can no longer exist out of political deliberation and action. Probably it never could, but the challenges we now confront are too big for a single individual to resolve. What we must stop right now is self-delusions, resorts to puristic arguments, futurist fantasies. For all such futurist fantasies, in effect, rely on 2 main fantasies. First, the technology will resolve the most pressing problems of today's existence, as in mortality, climate change, and so on. This is what Berkeley put up. Do you remember a world long ago when you didn't expect people to live to 120? Sorry, this is a futurist fantasy. And I find it totally pertinent that it's an old geezer who thinks he can get the drugs to live to 120. The second futurist fantasy is that humans as adaptable creatures will have adapted so quickly and thoroughly to new technological possibilities that they will be in some sense post-human, meaning not like us in our thinking and their motivations anyway, so there's nothing we can do. My work on pleasure has got me thinking in different ways than those futuristic fantasies. It's about how we need to reshape our institutions to take into account what humans have always needed. Lying flat is not the solution. You can do a lot if you decide to move with all due speed, but deliberately, it seems to me. As the Chinese thinkers would say, we can wait ardently upon things, letting the things themselves tell us what we need to know. The work is absorbing, not just petty stuff. It will last a lifetime. And I end on a song. Stacey Kent singing an American tune. We'll see if this works. Well, I wish I could sing. I was planning to sing along with her, but you would not like me singing. I think I'll end here. We'll see if Sonia can get it going. And if she can, we'll let you listen to this incredibly great snatch of a song. But if not, we're fine. I'm open for questions, comments. Thanks. So,
Sonia, are you able to get the song going? Okay, I guess not. Too bad. Well, thank you, Michael. That was a lovely lecture. And it reminds us that a reflection on something doesn't have to stop with a book. Book can just be a little way station on that path. Really enjoyed hearing how your thoughts have progressed since then. So if you'd like to ask a question, I'll try to put you in some sort of order. Would you like to raise your hand or?
Yeah, we'll see what happens. And actually, you can all go, because the PowerPoint will be uploaded. You can all go check the YouTube. It's a sublime song. Anyway, any questions?
Linda.
She's
sorry. I was just talking to someone coming into the office.
Maybe while people are thinking about a question, I can say that what I'm working on is a book that used to be called The Politics of the Common Good. And then I decided I didn't want to do that as the title. I'm not sure I have a new title, but the common good is always about what you give up for other people. And urban historians and environmentalists say other people, they are what we breathe. And that's quite different than thinking you're giving up something. So anyway, The Air We Breathe or something might be the title of the new book. Jennifer, if I may.
Thanks, and thank you so much for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, very good. I enjoyed that greatly, and it was such a pleasurable tour of so many authors that I love, and also so many authors that I don't know. And I felt something like a tension in the talk, and then I'm not sure if it's to be resolved or not, or maybe the tension might be part of the point, which is, I suppose there's a way of looking at pleasure as something that is immensely private and individual, right? That one has a relationship to one's own pleasure. And I felt that we were starting on a note when you described, how in small scale societies, you learn through trial and error that the short-lived pleasures aren't as aren't as valuable as the long-lasting sort of relational ones. That seem to be a matter of kind of like individual learning about these things. And there seemed to be something quite individual when you talked about there being no one right way to live one's life. You have to feel your way through the interstices, as an individual in butterfly mode, trying to be very porous and so on. So you can't just sort of take cultural instruction on the pursuit of pleasure. But then I was also, so it seems like every person has to sort of learn about themselves what their path to pleasure is. But then at the same time, I felt like the talk was at the same time tugging in a different direction when you're talking about the pleasures of rootedness in the collective and your awareness of the mental states of others and the social condition of others. I guess that's there in the Zhuangzi too. You're even aware that the fish are happy.
Those are great observations. And here's what I would say. I took my first Chinese class or Chinese history in Berkeley as an undergraduate. It was one of the last classes I took before the whole campus just erupted over the bombing of Cambodia. And as it happened, it was my teacher's last class because he gave up his life jacket to a small child who should have had one on it. But what I remember is there was a description of a Chinese family, and I was sitting next to another woman, and she said, "This is so weird." And I said, "Oh, do you think so? That sounds just like my family in Kentucky." My family on one side in Kentucky, and I think this is pertinent, has been there since before Kentucky was a state. On my father's side, my father was a recent immigrant who only met my mother because he was a poster boy for the Marines during World War II. Their worlds would never have collided. Okay. But what is true they were describing in my Chinese history class what is called the Dazhong, the big family, that everyone lives together, multi-generational, and lots of cousins and second cousins living together. Well, my grandfather, my whole life has been shaped by a person I never knew, my grandfather, because during the Depression, my grandfather was the only person who had a lot of money. And what he did was he took every single person in the family to his house, which was big enough to hold lots of people. And he educated them and started them in their businesses, and he kept people in the factories at their regular salary during the Depression. So my whole life, people have come up to me and said, "Your grandfather is the reason why I flourish today," or "My father flourished today," or something like this, okay? So I have been trained in the Anglo-American tradition, which, by the way, is not very similar to the European tradition, to believe I'm an individual, autonomous, rational human being. And all my work is saying that is the stupidest thing I have ever heard of. And it's taken me quite a long time. I mean, I keep reading more and more and more. I read, one of my teachers wrote a book called Against Individualism, Henry Rosemont Jr. And this past summer, because The Art of War was in my favorite bookstore right next to Judith Butler, she wrote The Force of I think it's called The Force of Nonviolence or something like that, that is also against individualism. I think individualism in Adam Smith or David Hume, or we can go to these people, didn't mean what it means today. which is I can do any damn thing I want if I can manage it. And I believe we have taken it into crazy lengths, and as an American, perhaps the craziest lengths I've ever seen, with gun control, with this, with that. And so what I realize is that I often still conceptualize, how will I get through this? And then my next thought is in the arms of friends, or by listening to music, or by going home, or by, but my first thought is, how will I get through this? And I get to the second thought, sometimes more quickly and sometimes less quickly. So I do think there's a tension. And since one of the things I'm arguing and will be arguing against in this book, whatever it's called, is that we have taken things too far if we think that life is A or not A. Life is A and not A almost all the time. Luckily, I've got good friends in the Berkeley philosophy department who'll bear with me in this. I don't think, and I think I come to this as a feminist and through care ethics and through all of this, life doesn't look like A or non-A. Life looks to me like a jumble, a muddle, Zhuangzi would say, that we try to, for me, the metaphor is often tacking. I used to be able to sail a boat. I doubt if I could do it anymore, but to go in a straight line, you go backwards and forwards. You're never really on the line. And so I think you're totally right. And I love you for pointing that out, because it's something I actually need to address, but I don't think it's just me that needs to. It is not just I, correctly said in grammatically correct English. It is practically everyone who operates in the Anglo-American tradition. We need to say, where have our universal truths gotten us? I don't think they've gotten us recently. Maybe it's just because they've been pushed too far. But I was reading something, and then I'll shut up, about Habermas, and I've never really loved Habermas. And the person was pointing out that Habermas, pretty much like Aristotle, pretty much like Plato, is imagining cultivated bourgeois people in a civil space, having access to certain kinds of cultivated conversations. I think that doesn't work for me anymore. In one bit of my life, it's not what I see my students having access to, so I'm immediately excluding my students. It's not actually where I think I want to be. I want to be in my community space in a hospitable way, the way my grandfather would have been hospitable. And my mother was herself hospitable to any and all comers, whether I like them or not.
Thanks for that. That's actually that's lovely. That's lovely. I love the emphasis on the interconnectedness of things there. Thank you for that.
Thanks for your question. It'll help me articulate this better next time.
Irina, do you want to ask a question?
Yes. Hi, Michael. Hi again.
No, it's great. I love it.
I was struck, I think I'm always struck by the things you say didn't happen. I was struck in your book when, the book that's not self-help. And I was struck by you're wanting to title the pleasure book Ordinary, it was Ordinary, right? Ordinary Pleasures. And partly because I've thought about writing a book on ordinary arts or everyday arts. And also not gotten the best reactions from other people about it. So I kind of, what does that tell us? What do you think that tells us about what
it does tell us? The press that I publish with, and really most of my experience with them was lovely. So I have to put that in context to be fair to them. They said, ordinary pleasures sound ordinary. We address a cultivated elite. Now, why did I go with them? They produce beautiful books. And I wanted the book to be a physical pleasure to read. So I went with them for a very simple reason, but maybe if that had been the first conversation I'd had with them, I would not have gone with them. Because I do think we're all afraid of what might be, and this is not a new fear, Adorno was afraid of this, what might debase us if we think about pop culture. But for me, the practices of everyday life was not only a seminal book for me, but a complete rethinking of what it is I think I'm doing when I do anything. Yeah, I think something in academia is also not friendly to ordinary. One of the first things that I give my students next semester is George Orwell's The Politics of the English Language. And as you remember, what he says is that Latinate words, the longer the better, are what people traffic in if they have access to those words. And what I have always tried to do is to, what a Southern preacher would say it plain. If you can say it plain, you actually have a thought. But it's so interesting that they, by the way, didn't want the Chinese pleasure book either. But at that point, I said, I think our contract is now null and void because you've rejected the book that we agreed upon. And by the follow-up mail, express, double express, no, here's, we're all signed, everything's done. But I would not have done that 10 years ago. It is simply that if you spend 18 years writing a book, you are pretty tired of people messing around with your titles. And right then, my good friend Daniel Boyarin had just been messed around with his title. And I just, for some reason, said, when do we get to title our own books and not have the marketing department title our books? So anyway, that was the first time I had what we call at home a hissy fit. And I'm glad I did. because probably the right title for the book is The Chinese Pleasure Book. And Ordinary Pleasures I would have liked even better, but that wasn't going to happen. So there we are. But if the way is simply putting one foot in front of the other, my colleague Hans Sluga blew my mind. He was teaching an undergraduate class, and I'm taking it when I'm in Berkeley. And for the first time ever, he was introducing Confucius and Xunzi into an ethics class, ethics and social justice. And so quite casually, Hans said, well, some student said, what is the way? And he said, well, of course it's life practice. What? Oh my God. I never thought it was that easy, but yes, it's that easy. So anyway, I think if we started to demand, I remember my first, what we called brown bag lunch when I was a graduate student, and I walked out of it and I said to someone, I'm too stupid to understand, but I didn't understand anything that was going on. And the person turned to me and said, please do not internalize your lack of understanding. Apparently, it wasn't conveyed clearly enough. And I still internalize my lack of understanding. But one part of me invokes this friend, a fellow graduate student from Princeton, who was older and wiser, and of course male, and told me not to worry about not understanding. So, yeah.
Can I ask, I'd like to ask a question myself.
Please.
So I've been thinking a lot about the origin of desire for the last couple of years, and thought I would poke a little bit at your distinction between pressing needs and flitting desires. I mean, that's a distinction that that's very often made in philosophical texts. But the way I've been thinking about it, if you think of a flitting desire like a desire for an ice cream bar.
Exactly. I was thinking of pistachio ice cream right then.
Oh, there you go. Yes, pistachio ice cream is perfect. If you think of that, and then you think of a pressing desire, which might be, a pressing need, which might be something like hunger. I've been wondering, like, what's the connection between that pressing need and that flitting desire? And it seems to me there can't be no connection. There has to be some connection. The pistachio ice cream is some kind of momentary realization of this pressing need. So where I'm coming from is, if desires do in fact have a foundation and somewhere that they come from, can you make such a, it's a sort of a derogatory distinction, right, between pressing needs?
Well, that's what's interesting. And I'll see if I can give you the slide, which we never saw. And maybe Sonia can help us. It says short-term delights, ethically neutral, versus long-term relational pleasures. That's the slide that never got seen. And
yeah,
so
I love your concept of relational pleasures.
So what's interesting about the Chinese is they actually use two different words for this. And they have other words for desires and wants and needs and things like this. But what they say is that short-term delights they are perforce ethically neutral until we do something with them, okay? But what they can do, because the Chinese have this resonance theory, is if I'm always literally chi, literally substance from my body. Those of you who know ancient Greek and Roman notions of how we saw things, that things traveled out from our eyes, and then something from the other person traveled back, okay? And what that means is that things are always traveling out. And so they ask the question, well, what do we make sure is traveling in? Okay. So they would call the short-term delight not bad, not anything wrong with it, but it can consume you if you go from short-term delight to short-term delight to short-term delight. I mean, I think of Imelda Marcos buying thousands of pairs of shoes. Each one of them must have given her a frisson of pleasure. Well, what's interesting is I get lots of these frissons. I love a scotch at the end of the day, and I love this and I love that, and I don't have a long-term relational pleasure with my scotch bottle. It's fine. I want it in my life. But what will sustain me is something different. And what's interesting is during the pandemic, we all had to be very careful how we were meeting with students, and the library was closed. And so I met my students out on my deck. You can do that in Berkeley all year round. And I put out a scotch bottle, or I put out beer, or I put out this, and I put out snacks. And I met them until the conversation was over, which was usually 2.5 hours. Because we were trying to get them to finish their theses or do their papers. Libraries are closed, you know, so a lot of it was strategizing together. I came out of those sessions just totally wasted. Because I'd prepared snacks for them, and I like good food, so they weren't junk food, but I rarely had dinner. After that, I went to the floor and lay down, and I love my students and they are worth loving. I lay down on the floor and just listened to music for about 30 minutes. And just let the music wash over me to try to gather, as the Chinese would say, my chi. My chi had gone out in these exchanges. And while I'd gotten something back, I was mostly pretending to them, and that's exhausting for me to pretend. I was mostly pretending everything will be all right. Your thesis is going to get finished, and you will move on. There will be jobs, there will be postdocs, there will be. When I am going, I'm in my heart of hearts terrified. As it happens, it worked out. But I'm very aware, partly because twice people have run into me with their cars because they were texting. I was in the approved space, but they were texting. And didn't notice me though. So I've had 2 recent people running over me, quite literally. And so I've had a lot of massage therapy. And I'm going, why did I wait so long to have twice a week somebody come in? She has great taste in music. She knows what she's doing. And this is when I gather my chi and I can make it through the next 3 or 4 days and do what needs to be done. So I think the Chinese metaphors of this chi that goes out, the chi that comes back, the gathering of one's resources from mostly other people, but also in the case of music. And I sometimes wonder that whether that's not from other people too. Whether I'm not thinking of, I saw Ella Fitzgerald when I was one of the last shows she did at Carnegie Hall. I spent a month's rent on going to see Ella Fitzgerald. Whether I'm not reliving these experiences and these people again. So even with music and books, I think of them as people. And that's the way people thought of books in manuscript culture, that this was just what's left behind from the person who copied it from a master. And for me, that tangible thing is very, very important, that touch. So I don't think short-term delights are a problem unless they become a problem, unless they become what distracts us from other important business we have. And so, yeah, I eat well, I'm a movie goer, I'm this, I'm a that. I drink good scotch, but I think about the way I use my short-term delights. So I don't need panna cotta every night, though it is a pleasure. How much do I need it? And I don't deny myself if I walk past someplace that has great panna cotta. But I go, no, I had that 3 days ago. I can space out this pleasure. It's probably not all that good for me to eat things that are so sugary, though I'm a Southerner and I love sugary things. So anyway, does that help? So
it sounds actually quite Aristotelian, I have to say.
I'm not surprised. I have had people tell me that that this is not so far away. I think for me, what I don't like about Aristotle, and probably it's a misapprehension. Martha Nussbaum said in some essay, it's a misapprehension. A lot of translations, and my Greek is really lousy. You know, I'm reading along with the Greek, but I'm definitely depending on the translation. A lot of the translations really make it seem that it might be possible to reach a state of great souledness that would be more than flitting. And I really doubt that. And I've known a lot of people that I regarded as great soul. But what they really always do is talk to me about how they were inadequate in this situation and they really should have said that and they regret this. And so I think I've been very lucky that I have had a lot of people in my life that were rather extraordinary examples of probably about the best you can aspire to. And then I've also known them to talk about their fragility. Men too, fragile. So this is, I think, why I say to myself, I couldn't be an Aristotelian, because I could never imagine an unchanging state as even the ideal. So I really like, there's a Chinese classic that says the only constant is change. And that's been my experience, that the only constant is change.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time, but Linda has a question, and then Michael, you have a very quick answer.
Yes.
Linda,
I'm
go ahead.
raising my hand for real this time, but I thought I would just, first of all, show everyone who might not have a physical copy of the book, because Michael, you talked about the book, you wanting it to be beautiful, and I'm not sure if this could be shown properly, but the texture of the cover is actually quite beautiful, because you could see that the blueberries or the fruit and the tree.
And of course, those are supposed to be peaches of immortality. It drove me crazy. They became blueberries.
But they're nonetheless beautiful.
It's true. And who cares really? But I cared. I was deeply upset. And I said, how much would it cost for me to pay for the pink, for the peaches of immortality to be on the cover? They said, oh, about $10,000.
Wow.
So I said, oh, maybe if you'd said 2 or 3, but no, I'll live with blueberries. There it is, because the Nelson Gallery director had said, quite unusually, take it for free. But it was really the cost of the printing. So they said, we need to do it in basically blue. I said, well, what if we change the yellow on the front of the book to pink? Would that make a difference? So we went through all of these things. And, basically, no, would not make a difference.
So I know we're out of time, but I just wanted to kind of quickly throw this out. Like, I find so interesting the kind of resistance you've had in 18 years in creating this book. And all of us here in this year in the Circle of Fellows are thinking about that. Or hopefully we'll all talk about it in some capacity in other weeks and the months to come. But I find that really interesting, the different forms of resistance from not just, it's something very thought-provoking.
Well, I had lunch with Curie, and we were talking about the times. This wasn't much of our conversation, but it was a little bit of our conversation. We were talking about the times when we've been put down in public. And she was talking about someone I actually like, who is almost universally hated. He's an arrogant, and I go, why wouldn't he be? He was anointed at age 15, and everything he ever did was get rewards for pouncing on people. So that's how it came up. I told her about one of my worst experiences, which was I was on a stage and it was an exhibition, and I was supposed to talk about the Han Dynasty artifacts, which included tomb tiles with sex scenes in them and humorous sex scenes in them. Okay. And also something distinctive to the area called the money tree. Well, quite flippantly, I said, my talk today is about money and sex and, blah, blah, blah. And then this Chinese guy came who was an older male, said, "You don't know anything about money and sex because there were never homosexuals in China before the Christian missionaries brought the problem." And, you know, it was one of those moments we were talking about colonization where I thought, I don't even know how I begin to say this, but I said very quietly, well, one of the first history books has a chapter devoted to the emperor's male favorites, which would suggest that there might be homosexuality before that. But Lothar von Falkenhausen, who can be quite aggressive, is an old friend as well, stood up and started shouting at the person and went into a tirade about how he didn't know anything. And I had, you know, devoted my life to this culture and blah, blah, blah. And of course, I was totally mortified. I was both thankful and mortified. And so we were talking, Curie and I, about what she said, her first comment, "It was so good that you had a man to tell the other man, you know, where to get it off, basically." And I said, yeah, but actually we should have developed those mechanisms. By this point, we say we're feminists. You know, why haven't we prepared a snappy, but well, the trouble is I want to be snappy. I could do that, but I want to be respectful. Even if I think this is the dumbest comment I've ever heard. And so I think, you know, it's really interesting, but I think I am in the resistance. And I think I gave up thinking I'd ever be anywhere else. I had such a lovely time at Bryn Mawr that I actually thought, I know everything now and I know how to do it. And boy, was I wrong. I came to Berkeley and it was like being a 13-year-old all over again. So how do I do this? And what am I going to argue against? And what am I just going to let go? So yeah, we're in the resistance. I think any thinking person now is in the resistance in one way or another.
All right.
I'm sure we've gone overtime, right?
Yeah, I didn't expect to end exactly there. But it's been wonderful to hear you, Michael, and I want to thank you very warmly and on the behalf of the Jackman Humanities Institute and all of us. Thank you so much for a great talk. And
yes, thank you. And actually, one couldn't be in the resistance unless institutions like this nurtured one. It would just be too hard. So thank you. Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, bye, bye.